thank you, the Camden conference organisers, for inviting me. It's what a pity we can't be there in reality, but we're here virtually, which is a big plus. I saw this title after back and forth, and we agreed on it. And I messaged my colleague here, Alton, saying, Alton, I think I've bitten more than I can chew. But then I was thinking of it, and it sort of crystallized, sadly, because of the war in Ukraine. So what I'm going to give you is a kind of presentation which tries to link all the four issues together and link them together on the issues of soft power and link them together on the issues of security and link them together on the issues of a kind of disingenuous presentation of what Europe thinks it is and how it sells itself. So let me begin with COVID, which is no stranger to any of us, and it's been with us for a very, very long time. First of all, the good news is that the EU has put forward an enormous financial package, a recovery package, for all the member states, provided they meet certain criteria. And this money will be allocated to these member states to give them recovery, to look at the infrastructure and other issues. This is an enormous sum of money. And the very interesting aspect of these sums of money is that for once Germany came on board to actually have a more integrated fiscal and financial and economic policy towards the EU. So in some ways, the pandemic did forge a kind of cautious, more integrated European Union. Because if you don't have economic integration and financial and fiscal integration, and even political integration, Europe will remain a kind of organization of disparate states with different threat assessments and different attitudes on how to deal with crisis. This is the first thing. Secondly, I don't think we should have any illusions about COVID. This is a pandemic which has tested the European Union. And in fact, the European Union has come out not particularly well in the beginning. The Commission was very, very slow off the blocks. And Angela Merkel, the former Chancellor, was in the lead in getting things rolling. But in fact, if you really look at the situation now in Europe, it's actually not particularly good. Hats off to the Spaniards. They suffered a huge amount and they went into huge quarantine. They seem to have it under control. And despite protests among most populations in Europe, the Italians and the Spaniards are acutely aware of how fast new elements of the pandemic spreads. But whatever the EU ambassador to Washington said last night, the vaccination uptake is extraordinarily low in some countries, particularly in Bulgaria and Romania, because of fake news, because of suspicion of the state, because of corruption, because of the way it's been handled, because of the lack of communication. And since these are EU members, they can travel freely throughout the European Union. So we have to be very careful that we can, if the European Union leaders want to pat themselves in the back, they should look at the very low uptake of the vaccinations in some countries, which actually really, really need it. And in fact, every country needs it. So this is the first point of the COVID. Second point of COVID is the political ramifications, which really cannot be underestimated. There's a couple of elements here. It played into the hands of populists in some ways, but also reignited a kind of antipathy towards the state, whether it's from the far left or the far right. Now, the far left and the far right actually were vaccine deniers, even probably corona deniers. And I know so many people saying, oh, this is all spread, it's all propaganda and so on, but they were against the vaccinations. But it's very easy to demonize such people, and we have to be very, very careful, because in between these two groups are actually ordinary people who just don't like the state interfering and telling them what to do. And so it has become a kind of tussle between the state and the role of the state and how it presents itself, and the role of the individual and individual rights. Is it right that an individual doesn't get vaccinated, but on the other hand causes risks to others? It's a huge debate. But at the end of the day, it is the role of the state and local government, and indeed the media, to communicate what is at stake and why this is important. And it's also very important to actually re-establish or keep on board the science element of this. Those who have the knowledge and those who actually want to explain to the public. And this has been extremely difficult, especially here in Germany, where the lead scientists and virologists and specialists have been bombarded with hate email, death threats. You cannot underestimate the hatred of these people. So COVID has unleashed this new kind of a politically aggressive element in the body politic, and we have to be very careful that even if COVID is brought under control and the pandemic, if it ever will disappear, this element of a different kind of opposition will not go away quickly. This is an important point to make. The implications for Europe are actually important, and it would be very important for the EU member states and governments to realize that this COVID has taught us or showed the weakness of communication between the citizens and governments. And this is hugely important, that governments and citizens get together and listen to each other. And there's enough problems in the United States with people not listening to each other. There's immense problems here, and maybe you don't see this from the American point of view. There's polarization. People don't listen to each other. The discourse has become very angry, very abrupt, very rough. And there's been an awful lot of disregard for serious politicians who want to reach out. So essentially, COVID has really fundamentally changed the political discourse. Bringing it back to the center, creating a kind of center ground is going to be very difficult to do, but it's actually important for the stability of the European Union member states, but also raises big questions about integration. In some ways, we may have the recovery fund spurred by COVID as a kind of huge, big push to get the European economies on the path to recovery again. But essentially, COVID has not integrated the European Union. It hasn't made it weaker, but it has showed up all the weaknesses, particularly the element of health. That's my last point about the COVID presentation. The health systems are so different across the member states. It's important to remember that there's been a huge exodus of medical staff, of talented people, of educated people from Bulgaria, from Romania, from Poland, from the Baltic states, over to Western Europe, and what was Britain, who used to be in the EU, over to France, Germany. Here, it's enormous. We have inherited enormous flow of talent. And what does this do? It leaves the hospitals bereft of skills, of people, of human resources, of simply people to look after the sick people. And secondly, when you have a huge exodus of talented people, you actually lose an element of accountability and questioning, and also raising the awareness that the hospitals and the infrastructure, particularly for health, are completely underfunded. This is such an important point. COVID should be the example, and the recovery funds should be used for building up a serious modern health infrastructure. Health is a human right, and also health is about jobs, economy, education, prosperity, and making a society healthier. So this is an element which hasn't really entered into the debate yet, but it really must, and the European Commission leaders should do this, but on the local level as well, on the member state level. So that's what I shall say about the challenges with COVID, because they're not going to go away. And if the pandemic is solved, we have to put these on our things to do list and get them implemented. Now, the climate issue, in some ways, it's a bit like COVID, because the climate change and the huge ambitious targets presented by the European Union demand two things. They demand communication. It's going to be a very long haul. And they demand the truth, that this is going to be extremely costly. Climate change is about changing the status quo. The status quo in how we live, what materials we use for our houses, what kind of windows we put in, what kind of heating, what kind of cars we drive, what kind of food we eat. The whole idea of climate change is still not being presented as a hard-nosed, long-term change in our way of life. I think governments are a bit afraid of this. I think they're reluctant to tell the truth. The new Green Social Democrat Liberal government here is really trying to explain to the public that this is going to cost a major change in our lifestyle. But because the German economy is deep pockets, there's going to be an awful lot of subsidies for modernizing housing and so on. But the climate change is such a major issue that, a bit like COVID, it already has a spin-off with those who deny climate change, or those who believe that they're not being told the truth and there's going to be hardships, and those who believe that, frankly, it really doesn't matter, and why can't we just live as we are going on? There's another element of climate change which I've always found very interesting. The EU has this very special way of presenting itself as the moral leader in some issues. And for years, they've set themselves up as, we are the best who will control the climate, who will limit a degradation of the climate. We will support the Paris Accords and everything else. And the other countries outside the EU look to Europe and say, well, really? Are you really doing this despite fossil fuels, despite coal imports in Poland, despite the existence of use of coal in Germany is going to be phased out? You've got so many different variants in this. But what is interesting about the climate change issue is, frankly, there's a bit of hypocrisy about this, especially when it comes to how we deal with imports and exports. If I may, let me read you out data from the Global Carbon Project. This is a research outfit. And they wrote recently about efforts to cut the carbon footprint in some of the EU member states. And by the way, just so that you know, the European Union wants to have net zero for the carbon footprint by 2050. Big ambition, hats off to them. But let me read you this. Per capita emissions in Denmark have fallen by about half since 2000. That's great news, no? But the pollution it imports in goods that used to be made there, but whose manufacturing is now outsourced to China and other places, has surged in the same period. Take the extra carbon its imports have generated in other countries into account, and Danish emissions are down by just 1/3, according to the data, as I mentioned, from the Global Carbon Project. So a scheme has been mooted to tax carbon emissions, but we don't know if this is going to happen. In other words, there's two sets of narratives going on. Yes, we're cutting back on all the carbon emissions, but on the other hand, we do export them and then import the products that are made. It's just food for thought on the fact that dealing with climate change cannot be put into a package inside the EU. It has enormous ramifications on how we deal with exports and how we deal with imports. And as David said in the very beginning, all the nuts and bolts of globalization feed into so many aspects now. And one could argue that the pandemic is a result of globalization because we can all travel, and disease and other elements travel so quickly in this new era. So the bottom line of this presentation of the climate change is that a little bit of more humility by the European Union would go a long way, frankly, and more communication by the European Union and all the member states would go a long way in telling the truth, and also more communication in terms of the enormous costs. And if we don't actually go along with these costs, we might as well just close down the planet. I mean, this is as serious as this. But the key thing is transparency, truth, communication, and be very, don't be hypocritical in terms of how we deal with exports and imports to deal with climate change. The third issue I get to, this is a very touchy one, is migration. And this is something that the Europeans share with the United States. We all know what Angela Merkel did. She was noble, and she did it for ethical reasons, moral reasons, and legal reasons by opening the borders to give 1 million refugees fleeing the war in Syria and Iraq, but particularly Syria, absolute refuge. And unless I'm wrong, one little boy was killed for a very different reason. I don't think one refugee died. Despite the bureaucratic hurdles in the beginning, they all got roofs over their head. I remember visiting hospitals, and the doctors said they were shocked by the condition, the physical condition of the psychological condition of the refugees. The hospitals opened their doors. It was a very moving experience for me living in Berlin during that year. And hats off to Angela Merkel that did it. And frankly, the Syrian refugees are learning German at a speed even faster than I did. They're trying to integrate. I must say, there's an awful lot of talent that came to Germany. And this is very, very important. Merkel was demonized for opening the borders. The migration issue, it opened a huge arguments within the member states. And so many countries just did not want to open the doors to these refugees who really needed security. And we now have a situation that the European Union has come out extremely badly from this refugee crisis. Frankly, some of the borders are closed. We still have the Schengen system where, in theory, still partly in practice, you can cross the borders without any kind of controls. But Hungary has this barbed wire fence. And after so many years, probably 20 years of discussing the need for a refugee and migration policy, it is still not agreed. There was one agreement, but it was thrown out. And there's all sorts of reasons not to have one. But it's essentially there's deep divisions in the member states about dealing with refugees. I must tell the audience, there is a difference between, of course, you know this, between refugees and migrants. Refugees who are fleeing and they need security, and it's a humanitarian and legal obligation. Migration is another big issue, and people migrate. We know why people migrate. They flee war, they flee conflict, they flee because of climate change, desertification, they flee because they want a better life, they flee because they want a perspective. And yet the European Union still hasn't got a migration policy on quotas. What's wrong with quotas? And also, you have to turn around migration the other way and ask, is the European Union actually doing enough to deal with migration? Dealing with migration by actually stopping people from crossing over to the Mediterranean and doing deals with Libya or other countries to stop them from leaving, that's not a strategy. That's not a policy. That's just plastering over an acute humanitarian problem. I only see I have 50 seconds left. So essentially, the whole refugee migration policy has left the European Union weaker, has left it more divided, and we've still put it on the back burner. We will see what happens during this awful war in Ukraine, how the European Union will deal with the refugees coming from Ukraine. One last point on migration and refugees, and I do have to spell this out. There's an element of racism here across most European countries. Those leaving Syria, Afghanistan, that's another issue, Iraq, they're Arabs, Muslims, Syrians, Afghanis, Pashtuns, but they are not in the psychology and outlook of the Europeans, us. And so it would be very interesting to see if the Europeans will open the doors to Ukrainians. Why? Because Ukraine is considered European, and they're not from the Middle East. I have to say this, and it's quite shameful how these perceptions have shaped the whole migration refugee issue. My last point, and I'll be as quick. I cut it, David. I cut it down to 20 minutes, but can I have another 2 minutes?
Judy, there's actually no rush, so please, we will come back to you for some Q&A in a little while. But take your time.
My last point is just tangentially linked to migration. People migrate also because of corruption, but corruption is actually not endemic, but it has taken on a very special level inside the European Union. And my colleague also will discuss this on on the abuse of funds and so on. But I want to deal with corruption on a different level. It's just not the corruption of giving these rich visas for rich oligarchs coming to Europe. It's just not about corruption in turning a blind eye on ill-begotten gains of wealthy Russian, Kazakhstan, Ukrainian oligarchs settling in parts of Europe without any accountability where the money comes from. I would argue to this audience that what has happened to the European Union is that it has corrupted its own language. It has corrupted its language when it comes to elements of deep concern when there's a war going on in Belarus. It has corrupted its language when it comes to values. Values have become a kind of insipid throwaway word that has lost any kind of deep meaning. Corruption has invaded the kind of bureaucracies of the member states and the bureaucracies of the EU organizations, in the sense that they're not corrupt in the old-fashioned way of misusing funds. It's a corruption of a belief. It's a corruption of ambition. It's a corruption of the way that they see the world, that soft power can be the substitute or the panacea for many of the ills across the world. And it's a corruption of this kind of ideology that because the EU is based on peace and economic prosperity and solidarity, actually these three words have become so abused, so misused, and so corrupt that unless the European Union redefines or finds a new language that has meaning, that is not thrown out lightly, that has depth, and that can be followed through, the idea of European integration is not going to work. In European integration, and I must admit, I still want it to work, it's going to be very, very difficult to work because of our different perceptions of threats. Just look how long it has taken the EU to deal with sanctions over Belarus and now Ukraine. It's not going to work because we have different threat perceptions. And fundamentally of all, it's not going to work because we have completely different historical, cultural experiences. And these have become so exacerbated over the past couple of years, particularly between the Western European countries and the East European countries. And as we sit here today, it is the Baltic states and Poland who have the empathy to understand what's happening in Ukraine. And for some other countries in Europe, Ukraine is a faraway country. And so we want to just keep our comfort zone intact. So I'm going to wrap up here now, and I hope I've managed to link the elements of security, the elements of speaking the truth, the elements of communication, and the elements that actually await Europe if it wants to stick together or just remain a disaggregate group of member states with very little power and very little influence, which China, no doubt, and Russia will exploit. Thank you very much.